On the morning of August 15, 1850, the house slaves of Colonel Benjamin Ashford's plantation entered the main parlor and found something they would never forget. The most powerful man in 3 counties sat motionless in his mahogany chair, his face wet with tears, clutching an object no one on the plantation had permission to touch, the silver pocket watch that had belonged to Elijah. Elijah wasn't dead. He'd been taken away 3 days earlier, sold to a slave trader from Alabama, whom the colonel had been forced to pay to silence a scandal. But what the servants saw that day wasn't the image of the respected planter who held court at the Savannah Gentlemen's Club. It was a man completely destroyed, whispering over and over words nobody could understand. "You belong to this house. You've always belonged to this house." But it wasn't Elijah's departure that scandalized Georgia society. It was what they discovered afterward. Secret letters, a diary hidden for 15 years, and a will the colonel had rewritten in secret, granting freedom to a slave whose name he refused to speak in public, but who occupied every page of his private thoughts. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and drop a comment telling me what country you're watching from. What you're about to hear is what the history books tried to bury. March 1835. Charleston Slave Market, South Carolina. The air hung heavy that March morning. The smell of sweat mixed with the sweet aroma of magnolia blossoms from nearby gardens created a suffocating atmosphere. The sun beat down on the cobblestones of the market square, its heat making the white men in their linen suits sweat beneath their wide-brimmed hats. There, among dozens of bodies displayed like cattle, stood Colonel Benjamin Ashford. At 46, he cut an imposing figure. Broad shoulders, precisely trimmed graying beard, dark eyes that seemed to appraise everything and everyone with the coldness of a man born to command. Owner of 3 cotton plantations and over 200 slaves, Benjamin represented everything Georgia society deemed respectable: power, fortune, and a bloodline tracing back to the first English settlers. That day, he wasn't there out of necessity. His plantations ran like clockwork. He'd come because Reverend Morrison, the family's minister, had suggested he purchase a trustworthy house slave, someone who could serve as butler and personal attendant. An intelligent man, Benjamin, the Reverend had said, someone who can read and write, useful for your business affairs. The auctioneer, a portly man with a grating voice, announced each lot with the same enthusiasm he'd use for selling horses. That's when Elijah stepped onto the platform. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Elijah was 31 years old, light-skinned with eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. His movements were contained, almost aristocratic. He wore only rough cotton trousers, and even in that degrading condition, there was a dignity about him that unsettled. He wasn't built like the field hands. He was lean, narrow-shouldered, with refined hands. But there was something more, something that made the buyers look away, uncomfortable. "This one here was a house servant for a Charleston family," the auctioneer explained, consulting his papers. "Can read, write, and do sums. Speaks French. Excellent for domestic service." Benjamin observed Elijah carefully. For an instant, their eyes met. And in that second, just 1 second, something changed. Benjamin couldn't explain what it was. A strange sensation in his chest. A curiosity that wasn't merely practical. "How much?" the colonel asked, his voice firm. The bidding was quick. Nobody else raised a hand. When the hammer fell, Elijah belonged to Benjamin Ashford. On the journey back to the plantation, in the carriage that rattled along the red clay roads, Benjamin couldn't stop observing Elijah in the small mirror he carried. The slave kept his eyes down, hands on his knees in absolute silence. But there was something in that silence that disturbed the colonel. It wasn't submission, it was control. "You really can read?" Benjamin asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, sir." "And write?" "Yes, sir." "Who taught you?" Elijah hesitated for the first time. "The mistress of the house where I served, sir. She taught me when I was a child. Said I had a gift for letters." Benjamin nodded. He said nothing more for the rest of the journey, but something inside him had been touched, something dangerous. When they arrived at the plantation at dusk, the colonel took Elijah directly to the main house. The other slaves watched with curiosity. Elijah wasn't taken to the quarters. He was led to a small room at the back of the house next to the pantry, a rare privilege. "You'll tend to my library," Benjamin said. "You'll organize my books, clean the study, and serve me when I'm working. If you do good work, you'll be treated different from the others." "Yes, sir," Elijah responded, keeping his eyes on the floor. But when Benjamin turned to leave, He heard Elijah whisper, "Thank you, sir." There was gratitude in that voice. And something more. Something that made the colonel stop in the doorway, hand on the frame, unable to leave immediately. That night, Benjamin didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about that encounter. Those eyes, that silence that seemed to say everything without saying anything. He didn't know it, but he'd just purchased far more than a slave. He'd purchased his own destruction. Elijah's first months on the plantation were marked by silent efficiency. He organized the colonel's library with surprising precision, cataloging books in English, French, and Latin. He cleaned the study every morning before dawn, prepared coffee at exactly the right temperature, and disappeared to his duties without ever being seen when not needed. Benjamin began noticing details, the way Elijah folded handkerchiefs, how he selected the right cigars, how he seemed to anticipate what the colonel needed before he even asked. "It's like he reads my mind," Benjamin remarked once to Reverend Morrison, who'd come for supper at the plantation. "Be careful, my friend," the Reverend replied with a condescending smile. "The most intelligent slaves are also the most dangerous. They know how to use our trust against us." But Benjamin saw no danger in Elijah. He saw something he couldn't name. It was on a June night in 1836, more than a year after the purchase, that everything changed. Benjamin was in the study, trying to read a French philosophy treatise he'd ordered from Charleston. The text was difficult, full of concepts that escaped him. Frustrated, he threw the book on the desk. Elijah, who was in the adjacent room organizing documents, heard the noise and appeared at the door. "Forgive me, sir, do you need something?" Benjamin looked at him, exhausted. "This damned book. I can't understand half of what's written." Elijah approached slowly, respectfully. He picked up the book, read a few lines. "It's Montesquieu, sir, the spirit of laws. He speaks about how laws should serve men, not men the laws." Benjamin froze. You know this book?" "I've read it, sir, at the house where I served before. The old master had a large library. I would read at night when everyone was asleep." For the first time, Benjamin saw Elijah raise his eyes completely, and in that gaze, there was an intelligence that both frightened and fascinated him. "Sit down," Benjamin said, pointing to the chair across from his desk. Elijah hesitated. "Sir, I can't." "I said sit down." Elijah obeyed, tense. For the next 2 hours, they talked about the book. Elijah explained the concepts with impressive clarity. He spoke about liberty, justice, about different forms of government, and Benjamin, the man who owned over 200 human beings, listened fascinated to a slave's words about what it meant to be free. When the clock struck midnight, Benjamin realized he'd spent hours conversing with someone who was officially his property. He felt a chill. "You can go," he said, suddenly uncomfortable. Elijah stood. At the door, he turned. "Sir, may I ask something?" "Go ahead." "Why do you have me read these books?" Benjamin had no answer. Or he did, but didn't want to admit it. Because you understand," he said finally. "You understand in a way nobody else here understands." Elijah nodded slowly, and there was something in his eyes, a comprehension, a connection that needed no words. From that night on, a routine was established. Every evening after supper, Benjamin would call Elijah to the study. Officially, it was to discuss the organization of books. In practice, they talked about everything: philosophy, politics, religion, morality. Benjamin discovered that Elijah had his own opinions, complex thoughts, a worldview that challenged everything he'd learned about slaves. And more disturbing, he began to value those opinions, to wait for them, to miss them when Elijah wasn't around. "I don't know what I saw in you," Benjamin said one night, looking at Elijah with an intensity that frightened them both. "Perhaps something that was always in me, but that I could never acknowledge." Elijah didn't respond. He just held the colonel's gaze, and in that silence something forbidden began to take shape. But that same night someone was watching through the crack in the door. Sarah, the house slave who'd served the family for 20 years, saw everything, and what she saw made her tremble. There was no touch, no explicit words, but there was something in the air of that room that was undeniable. There was an intimacy that shouldn't exist. Sarah closed the door silently and returned to her quarters, heart racing. She knew she'd just witnessed something dangerous, something that could destroy them all. For 3 years, the relationship between Benjamin and Elijah existed in that undefined space. It wasn't just master and slave, but it also wasn't— what else could it be? They themselves didn't know how to name it. Benjamin began giving gifts to Elijah: better clothes, a silver rosary, books he purchased specially on trips to Savannah. Elijah, in turn, became indispensable, not just as a servant, but as the only person with whom the colonel could truly be himself. "Sometimes I think you know me better than I know myself," Benjamin said one night in 1839. "You allow me to know you, sir?" Elijah responded in that always calm voice. "That's a privilege few slaves have. You're not like the others. In the eyes of the law, sir, I'm exactly like the others." Benjamin fell silent. That truth hurt, but the reality they tried to ignore couldn't be hidden forever. Sarah watched everything. She saw how the colonel spent hours in the study with Elijah, how he looked at him, how his voice changed when he spoke to him, and she wasn't the only one noticing. The other slaves whispered. Reverend Morrison began asking subtle questions, and the colonel's wife, Mrs. Eleanor, who lived in the Savannah townhouse and visited the plantation only twice a year, began hearing rumors. It was in May 1840 that everything collapsed. Mrs. Eleanor arrived unannounced at the plantation, bringing Reverend Morrison and a notary. She entered the main house with a set face, hard eyes. "Where is my husband?" Sarah, frightened, indicated the study. Mrs. Eleanor climbed the stairs with firm steps, followed by the Reverend. When she opened the door, she found Benjamin and Elijah sitting side by side, reading a book together. There was nothing explicitly condemnable in that scene, but there was a closeness, an intimacy that screamed. "Benjamin," Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice cutting like a razor, "I need to speak with you now." Elijah stood immediately, head down, but Mrs. Eleanor stopped him. "No, you stay. I want you to hear what I have to say." Reverend Morrison entered behind her, his face grave. "Benjamin," Mrs. Eleanor began, "for years I've been hearing gossip about you and this slave. I ignored it because I thought it was just the talk of envious people. But now the rumors have reached Savannah. The families are talking. They say you spend more time with him than with me, that you treat him as if he were an equal. Eleanor, you don't understand." "I don't understand, or I don't want to understand," she pointed at Elijah. "This man is your property, Benjamin, your property, but you dress him as if he were free, educate him as if he were your son, spend nights locked in this study with him. We only talk about books." "About books?" Her voice trembled. "We've been married 15 years. You've never spent 2 hours talking to me about anything, but with him you spend entire nights." Reverend Morrison stepped forward. "Benjamin, my friend, we need to discuss the nature of this friendship." "Friendship?" Mrs. Eleanor laughed bitterly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Benjamin felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He looked at Elijah, who stood paralyzed, head down, fists clenched. "Reverend," Benjamin said, trying to maintain composure, "Elijah is an educated man. We discuss philosophy, morality, about what a master shouldn't discuss with a slave," the Reverend interrupted. "Benjamin, don't you see the danger? You're creating a dependency. You're erasing the lines that God established between master and servant. And if those lines are wrong," the silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Eleanor looked at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. "You're defending this? You're defending what exactly, Benjamin?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. "This slave needs to be sold," Mrs. Eleanor said categorically. "Immediately." "No!" Benjamin's voice thundered through the room. Everyone turned to him. "He stays," Benjamin said, trembling. "He stays because I need him." The words hung in the air, heavy, final. Elijah raised his eyes for the first time, looking at Benjamin. There were tears on his face. Mrs. Eleanor stepped back, horrified. Did you hear what you said?" Reverend Morrison made the sign of the cross. "Good Lord. Get out of here," Mrs. Eleanor said to Elijah, her voice breaking. "Get out before I do something I'll regret." Elijah looked at Benjamin one last time, a silent goodbye, and left. When the door closed, Mrs. Eleanor collapsed in the chair. "Benjamin, what have you done? What have we done to deserve this humiliation?" "I didn't choose this," Benjamin whispered. "Then what is it?" He had no answer. Or he did, but the words were impossible to speak. From that night on, nothing was silent anymore. Before we continue, I want to make a request. If you value stories like this being told, support the channel with a super thanks up to $100. Every contribution allows me to keep researching and bringing narratives that were erased from official history. Can't contribute? Share. There are people who desperately need to know they've always existed, that they're not the first, that they have ancestors who loved and resisted before them. Your share could change someone's life. After the confrontation, Mrs. Eleanor gave an ultimatum. Either Elijah would be sold, or she would leave the plantation and take with her the family name, the reputation, everything. Benjamin knew he had no choice. Georgia society wouldn't forgive such a scandal. He'd be expelled from his clubs, lose business deals. His children would be marked by shame. But how do you sell someone who'd become as essential as the air you breathe? For weeks, Benjamin tried to negotiate. He offered to send Elijah to another plantation of his, far away. Mrs. Eleanor refused. He offered to free him in secret. Reverend Morrison said that would be admitting the sin. Finally, in August 1840, Benjamin yielded. He hired traders from Alabama to take Elijah far away, deep south, where he'd be sold to some cotton farmer. The night before departure, Benjamin went down to Elijah's room. He found him sitting on the small cot, the silver pocket watch in his hands, the gift Benjamin had given him years before. Elijah, the slave stood, his eyes red, but he said nothing. "I tried," Benjamin whispered, tears in his voice. "I tried to find another solution, but they all demand you go." "I know, sir." "Don't call me sir. Not now." Elijah took a step forward. For the first time in 5 years, he touched Benjamin's arm. It was just a touch, brief, but it said everything. "You belong to this house," Benjamin said, voice breaking. "You've always belonged to this house." "I don't belong, sir. I never did, because belonging means having a choice, and I never had one." The words cut Benjamin like a blade. "If I could change this." "But you can't. Nobody can." Benjamin gripped Elijah's shoulders. "I'll write letters. I'll find you. I'll buy you back when things calm down." Elijah smiled, sad. "You know that won't happen, sir." "Why not?" "Because you're a 61-year-old man, Colonel Benjamin Ashford. You have family, you have a name, you have God and the church. And I'm just Elijah, the slave nobody dares to mention." Benjamin recoiled as if he'd been punched. Elijah placed the watch in his hands. "Keep this, to remember I existed, that I wasn't just a forgotten name." "Elijah!" But the slave had already turned his back. "Excuse me, sir. I need to sleep. Tomorrow's a long day." Benjamin left that room destroyed. He went up to his study and for the first time in 40 years wept. The next day, Elijah was taken away. Sarah watched from a distance, hands trembling. The other slaves observed in silence, and Benjamin stood on the veranda of the main house, watching the wagon disappear down the red clay road, taking with it the only person he'd ever truly loved. Mrs. Eleanor stayed for 2 weeks, making sure there were no traces of Elijah on the plantation. She burned the clothes he wore, donated the books Benjamin had given him, erased his name from all records. "Now," she told Benjamin, "we can pretend none of this happened." But Benjamin couldn't pretend. He locked himself in the study, stopped eating, stopped sleeping properly. He spent nights sitting in the mahogany chair, holding Elijah's watch, repeating the same words. "You belong to this house. You've always belonged to this house." Sarah, who continued serving the family, watched the colonel disintegrate. One morning she found him collapsed in the study. She called the doctor. "It's exhaustion," the doctor said, "and something more, something I can't diagnose. It's as if he's lost the will to live." Mrs. Eleanor returned to Savannah. She couldn't bear seeing her husband like this. Reverend Morrison came to visit, trying to extract a confession, but Benjamin confessed nothing. "It wasn't a sin," he'd say, voice weak. "It was the only real thing I ever lived." The Reverend would shake his head, pray, and leave. Months dragged on. Benjamin aged years in a matter of weeks. His hair, which had been grey, turned white. His eyes, once commanding, became empty. That's when he decided to do something that would change everything. In December 1840, he called the notary. In the presence of Sarah and Reverend Morrison, he rewrote his will. He donated part of his land for the construction of a school for freed slaves, and included a specific clause. "I leave instructions that upon my death, the slave Elijah, purchased in Charleston in 1835, be sought out and granted immediate freedom, along with a sum sufficient for him to live with dignity." The notary hesitated. "Sir, this is extremely unusual." "Write it," Reverend Morrison protested. "Benjamin, you're legitimizing—" "I'm correcting," the colonel interrupted. "I'm correcting the only mistake that matters." When the document was signed, Benjamin felt a peace he hadn't known in months. "Now," he whispered to himself, "he'll be free, even if I'm not here to see it." Sarah, who'd witnessed everything, wiped her tears. For the first time, she understood the depth of that impossible bond. It wasn't possession. It never had been. It was love, forbidden, condemned, impossible, but love. and the colonel had chosen to honor it the only way he could, ensuring Elijah would be free. Benjamin Ashford died in March 1844 at age 64, officially of natural causes. But Sarah, who cared for him in his final days, knew the truth. He died of loneliness. When the will was read, the family was scandalized. They tried to contest it, but the document was legal, registered, witnessed. They couldn't annul it. It took 6 months to find Elijah. He was on a plantation in Alabama, working the cotton harvest. When he received the news, freedom and a sum of money, he didn't react. He just closed his eyes, hands trembling. "Colonel Ashford, Jew," the messenger said. "He asked that I give you this." It was a letter. Elijah opened it carefully. "Elijah, when you read this, I'll no longer be alive. I didn't have the courage to confess while I breathed, but now before God I confess. You were the only person I truly knew, the only one with whom I could be myself. Forgive me for not being strong enough to protect you. Forgive me for allowing them to take you away. Forgive me for hiding what I felt, afraid of what others would say. You once told me you never belonged to this house. You were right. But I, Elijah, I always belonged to you. From the day I saw you in that market, you owned the only part of me that mattered, my soul. Be free, live. And when you think of me, don't remember the colonel who held you captive. Remember the man who, for a few nights, managed to be true by your side. Yours forever, Benjamin." Elijah folded the letter slowly. He kept it with the silver watch that, even after 4 years, he still carried hidden. He used the money to travel north. He settled in Philadelphia, where nobody knew him. He worked as a private tutor, teaching merchants' children to read and write. He never married, never spoke about the years on the colonel's plantation. But every night before sleeping, he held the watch and whispered, "You belong to me too, sir, in the only way you could." Decades later, in 1865, when emancipation finally came, Elijah was 61 years old. A young abolitionist journalist, interested in stories of freed slaves, sought him out for an interview. "You lived most of your life enslaved," the young man said. "You must have many stories of suffering." Elijah was silent for a long time. Then he answered, "I suffered, yes, but I also knew something few people know. I knew someone who, despite all the chains society placed between us, saw me as a human being. And who paid the price for it. Who was this person?" Elijah smiled, sad. "Someone whose name I shouldn't mention, because erasing a name is another form of domination, and I won't perpetuate what they did to us." The journalist didn't understand, but he recorded the phrase in his notebook. Years after Elijah's death in 1880, a historian found Benjamin's will and the letter in the family archives. He tried to publish the story. The Ashford family paid a fortune to suppress the publication. But truth has a way of surviving. In 1920, fragments of the story were published in a small abolitionist newspaper in Atlanta. In 1950, a researcher included the case in a study about relationships between masters and slaves during the antebellum period. And today, more than 100 years later, the story of Benjamin and Elijah continues to be whispered in Georgia, not as scandal, but as proof. Proof that even in the most inhumane system ever created, love found its way. Imperfect, forbidden, condemned, but real. The plantation house where they lived was demolished in 1912, but locals say that on certain nights you can still hear a voice whispering in the wind, "You belong to this house," and another voice answering, soft, "And you belong to me." And you? Would you have the courage to love against the rules? To recognize humanity where society only sees property? To leave a legacy of truth, even if it costs everything? Drop your opinion in the comments. Was Benjamin a coward for not fighting harder? Or was he brave for doing what he could within a system that crushed him? And Elijah, do you think he forgave him? History doesn't give easy answers. It only forces us to look in the mirror and ask, what would I do? And if, after all this, you want to hear stories where feeling finds another setting, far from the plantation, under open skies, I have another channel just about cowboys in love. There, the weight changes, but the intensity remains. The link is pinned in the first comment.